For more videos like this, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. The Night Stalker, the true story of Richard Ramirez. Shadows in El Paso. Long before the world knew the name Night Stalker, before the pentagram etched on his palm, and before the panicked cries across Los Angeles, there was simply Richard, born Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez on February 29, 1960. In El Paso, Texas, he was the youngest of 5 children in a Mexican-American family that was struggling financially, emotionally, and spiritually. His father, Julian Ramirez, was a former Juarez police officer turned laborer for the Santa Fe Railroad. Julian was a strict disciplinarian. Richard, small and sickly as a child due to seizures and chronic health issues, was often on the receiving end of his father's explosive temper. The house was filled with yelling and the ever-present sting of belt lashes. Even as a young boy, Richard learned that silence was survival, and darkness held a strange comfort. His mother, Mercedes, was more nurturing but helpless against the storm of violence brewing in their home. She worked at a boot factory and was exposed to chemicals during her pregnancies. Some would later speculate this may have contributed to Richard's early health problems. But the deeper scars weren't physical, they were psychological. By the time he was 12, Richard found refuge in the shadows literally. He started sleeping in cemeteries to escape the chaos at home. He became fascinated with death, horror films, and the macabre. Unlike most children who feared the monsters in the movies, Richard admired them. The pivotal figure in Richard's formative years was his older cousin, Miguel Mike Ramirez, a Vietnam War veteran. Mike was a decorated Green Beret who returned from the war with a box of Polaroids, a stash of weapons, and a mind fractured by trauma and violence. He was Richard's hero. Mike shared stories with Richard about his time in the jungle, stories of ambushes, booby traps, and executions. But the most disturbing part wasn't the tales, it was the photos. In graphic, gruesome detail, Mike showed Richard snapshots of Vietnamese women he had raped and mutilated, some with their heads severed, some smiling in twisted poses before their final moments. To a teenage Richard, these images weren't warnings, they were lessons. Mike taught Richard how to handle firearms and stealthily stalk prey. He called it jungle justice. For Mike, it was war. For Richard, it became a blueprint. Then came the night that sealed Richard's descent into the abyss. It was 1973. Richard, only 13, was visiting Mike at his home when an argument broke out between Mike and his wife, Jessie. In a flash, Mike pulled out a .38 caliber revolver and shot her in the face at point-blank range. Richard stood nearby. Blood sprayed the walls, and Jessie collapsed in a lifeless heap. Richard didn't flinch. Though Mike was arrested and charged with murder, he was found not guilty by reason of insanity and sent to a state mental hospital. The legal system failed to realize that the real damage had already been done. The impressionable boy, who watched it all unfold with cold detachment. After Mike was institutionalized, Richard's descent accelerated. He started using LSD, dropped out of school, and delved deeper into the world of Satanism and the occult. He grew obsessed with Anton LaVey's Satanic Bible, embracing its philosophy of indulgence, power, and rebellion against religious norms. He moved to California in his early 20s, drawn by the allure of anonymity and darkness in the sprawling, sun-drenched metropolis of Los Angeles. But he wasn't seeking fame, fortune, or a fresh start. Richard Ramirez had come to Los Angeles to become a predator, and soon the city would bleed. The first kill. Los Angeles in the early 1980s was a city of contradiction. Neon lights glowed above homeless encampments. Movie stars mingled with drug dealers in Hollywood nightclubs. The city of angels was booming, sprawling, and rotting all at once. Beneath the glamour, something sinister stirred. In this melting pot of chaos and opportunity, Richard Ramirez arrived like a ghost. He drifted between low-budget hotels and dark alleys. He panhandled, he stole. He loitered in porn shops and slept in graveyards. But more importantly, he watched. He studied the city's pulse, its alleys, its open windows, its routines. He became fascinated by the city's vulnerability. His criminal activity began small, breaking into cars, stealing radios, robbing stores. He often targeted women's homes, lifting jewelry and undergarments. inhaling the scent of fear that lingered behind. These petty crimes were practiced while he was sharpening his knife, metaphorically and literally. Then came June 28, 1984. It was a sweltering summer night in the Glassell Park neighborhood of Los Angeles. The city buzzed with life, unaware that something evil had just slipped through its cracks. Jenny Vinco was 79 years old, a widow who lived alone in a modest apartment. She was gentle and devout, with a routine life centered around her son, Jack, who visited her frequently. That evening, after not hearing from his mother, Jack came to check on her. What he found would haunt him forever. Jenny was sprawled on her bed. Her throat had been slashed so deeply she was nearly decapitated. Her body bore multiple stab wounds. Her home had been ransacked, her belongings scattered like leaves in a storm. But most chilling was the utter lack of remorse or hesitation evident in the scene. Police arrived and found no fingerprints, no suspects, and no motive. Just a brutal, senseless murder that stunned the neighborhood. At the time, there was no name attached to the killer. He was just another phantom in a city of shadows. But for Richard Ramirez, this was not just a killing. It was a spiritual awakening. He felt exhilarated, empowered, in control. And most dangerously, he felt nothing. No guilt, no fear, just hunger. The high from killing Jenny Vinco didn't last long. Within weeks, the compulsion returned, stronger than ever. Ramirez started trolling late at night, driving a stolen car through suburban streets, seeking unlocked windows, open garages, or simply houses with an easy escape route. He became nocturnal, like a rat in a maze. But this rat had a mission. And soon, the body count would rise. Satan's soldier. By 1985, Ramirez had fully embraced the identity he was crafting: a shadowy, sadistic figure inspired by Satan and fueled by death. His obsession with the occult deepened. He began leaving pentagrams at crime scenes, sometimes etched on walls, sometimes drawn on his own skin. He whispered "Hail Satan" during attacks and believed the devil was guiding him, rewarding him. In March 1985, the next killing shook the San Gabriel Valley. Maria Hernandez, 22, was returning home to the condominium she shared with her roommate, Dale Okazaki. As Maria opened the garage, she came face to face with a stranger in dark clothing, his face obscured by a black cap. He raised a handgun. In a panic, Maria threw her hands up. The bullet bounced off her car keys, sparing her life. She collapsed and played dead. Ramirez, thinking she was gone, moved into the condo. Inside, Dale had heard the commotion and ducked behind the kitchen counter. But she made a fatal mistake. She peeked over the edge, and Ramirez shot her in the forehead, killing her instantly. Fleeing the scene, Ramirez didn't stop. Within an hour, he pulled 30-year-old Silean Veronica Yu from her car in Monterey Park and shot her point blank in the chest. She died in the street, her blood soaking into the pavement. That night marked a turning point. The media connected the attacks, and the city began to tremble. The press dubbed him the walking killer or the Valley Intruder, but the name that would stick hadn't yet surfaced. Meanwhile, Ramirez relished the headlines. He followed the news closely. He admired how icily he slipped in and out, how unstoppable he felt. In the months that followed, his spree became more violent, more sexual, more depraved. He attacked Vincent and Maxine Zatzera in Whittier in March. Vincent was shot in his sleep, while Maxine was tied, raped, and stabbed repeatedly. He gouged her eyes out and placed them in a jewelry box, which he took with him. The brutality stunned even veteran detectives. This was no ordinary killer. This was something darker. Then came the murders of William and Lily Doy in Monterey Park, followed by a blitz of attacks across Los Angeles County. Elderly couples, young women, children, no one was safe. He broke into homes with surgical precision, always in the dead of night, always vanishing before dawn. He used guns, knives, hammers. He raped, bludgeoned, and mutilated. In many cases, he forced victims to profess loyalty to Satan before killing them. Some he let live, especially children, perhaps for cruelty, or perhaps because even he had lines he didn't cross. But more often, death followed his footsteps. By the summer of 1985, fear consumed Los Angeles. Residents triple-locked their doors, bought guns, and slept with lights on. Hardware stores couldn't keep locks in stock. People were afraid to breathe. The LAPD and Sheriff's Department were under pressure to act. Hundreds of tips poured in. Psychic hotlines were overwhelmed. But still, Ramirez roamed free, feeding off the hysteria he created. And then, he made a mistake. Mistakes in the darkness? For months, the Night Stalker was a ghost of phantom predator who moved with silent violence, entering homes like a vapor and leaving devastation behind. But even phantoms bleed. By July 1985, Richard Ramirez was growing careless. The rush of infamy had begun to cloud his judgment. He believed Satan protected him, that he was invincible. But evil, when overfed, becomes sloppy. On July 20th, he struck twice in one night. His first victims were Max and Leela, needing a couple in their late 60s, living peacefully in Glendale. Ramirez broke into their home through an unlocked window. He shot Max in the head as he slept. Then he turned his attention to Leela. He raped her, then bludgeoned her to death with a lamp. Her face was unrecognizable. He smeared a pentagram on the wall with her lipstick. Later that same night, he drove to Sun Valley, where he broke into the home of 32-year-old Chanarong Covenant, a Thai-American man who lived with his wife and 8-year-old son. Chanarong was shot and killed instantly. Ramirez then tied up his wife and son, raped the woman repeatedly, and ransacked their home before fleeing into the night. He left behind fingerprints. This time, they were usable. The breakthrough came quietly. Investigators ran the prints and found a match in the criminal database. Richard Ramirez, a known thief and drifter with a long rap sheet. He had been arrested multiple times for car theft, drug possession, and burglary. But now, he was something else entirely. The LAPD put out an all-points bulletin. His mugshot taken during a previous car theft arrest was released to the public. Finally, the Night Stalker had a face, and Los Angeles held its breath. But Ramirez was already gone. Sensing the net tightening, he fled the city. For several days, he vanished. Some thought he might be heading to Tijuana. Others believed he would lay low in the desert. But evil doesn't hide, it hunts. On August 6, 1985, he reappeared. This time in Northridge. He broke into the home of Chris and Virginia Peterson, shooting them both in the head. Miraculously, they survived. Despite their injuries, they provided a description of their attacker: tall, gaunt, foul-smelling, with decaying teeth and wild eyes. The next night, he attacked the Geniels and Sakina Abawath, a young couple with a 2-year-old son. Elias was shot in the head. Ramirez then assaulted Sakina, tied her up, and ransacked their home. He whispered satanic prayers as he raped her. He told her he was a servant of the devil. Then, as always, he vanished. But now, the panic had shifted to rage. The public was no longer just terrified, they were ready to fight back. The city fights back. By late August, Richard Ramirez had become the most wanted man in California. His face was everywhere, on newspapers, on televisions, in storefront windows. The media had given him the name he would carry forever, the Night Stalker. He wore it like armor. But on August 30th, 1985, his reign of terror came to an abrupt end. That morning, unaware his face had been broadcast nationwide, Ramirez boarded a Greyhound bus from Tucson back to Los Angeles. He had been visiting his brother and was completely oblivious to the chaos his image had caused. As he stepped off the bus in downtown LA, he noticed the tension in the air. People were staring, whispering. One man pointed. Ramirez walked into a liquor store. Behind the counter, a Spanish-speaking man recognized him instantly from the newspapers. El Matador, he muttered, the killer. Richard turned to see several bystanders approaching. One of them yelled his name. Another shouted in Spanish, "That's him." The Night Stalker. Panic surged. Ramirez bolted out of the store and ran. He sprinted across the street, darted through traffic, and ran into a densely packed East LA neighborhood. But this wasn't the same city he had stalked in the dark. This time, the prey fought back. Residents chased him through alleyways and over fences. He tried to steal a car, but the owner dragged him out. Another man hit him over the head with a metal pipe. He stumbled, bleeding. More people joined the chase. A small mob tackled him, punching and kicking. restraining him until police arrived. When the LAPD finally showed up, Ramirez was bruised, battered, and bleeding. As they cuffed him, he looked at the angry crowd and smiled. "You got me," he said. The city erupted in celebration. The monster was caught, but the nightmare wasn't over, not yet. Trial of the century. After more than a year of bloodshed, fear, and darkness, the capture of Richard Ramirez felt like the end of a horror film. But the next chapter would be a psychological drama, real-life courtroom saga that would stretch for years, test the limits of the justice system, and offer a window into the mind of true evil. Richard Ramirez's trial began on July 22, 1988, nearly 3 years after his arrest. By then, the case had ballooned into one of the most complex criminal prosecutions in California history. He was charged with 43 felony counts, including 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Fingerprints, ballistic matches, shoe prints, DNA, eyewitness accounts, and stolen property found in his possession. Still, Ramirez pled not guilty on all counts, but this was no ordinary trial. From the very first day, the courtroom became a theater of the bizarre. Ramirez arrived at his arraignment with a pentagram drawn on the palm of his hand. As cameras flashed, he lifted it high and said clearly, "Hail Satan." The public was repulsed, but fascinated. Ramirez's appearance didn't help his skeletal frame. Long, unwashed black hair, sunken cheeks, and rotting teeth made him appear more ghoul than man. Yet somehow, he had become a cult figure. A group of female admirers later, called the Night Stalker groupies, began attending court regularly. Some wrote him love letters. Others claimed to be drawn to his energy. One woman would later marry him. Jury selection alone took over a year. Many prospective jurors feared for their lives, convinced the Night Stalker might have followers ready to strike. One juror was dismissed after revealing she had fallen in love with Ramirez. On September 20th, 1989, after a year-long trial and over 100 witnesses, the jury found Richard Ramirez guilty on all counts. The verdict was read aloud in a silent courtroom as he stood expressionless. Then came the sentencing phase. As the judge prepared to deliver the death penalty, Ramirez smirked and leaned toward the microphone. "Big deal. Death always comes with the territory. I'll see you in Disneyland." The courtroom was stunned, but justice had been served. He was sentenced to death in the gas chamber, a punishment he would never live to face. Death Row Devil. Richard Ramirez was transferred to San Quentin State Prison, where California's death row inmates were housed. It was a place of hardened killers and lifers, yet even there, Ramirez was considered different, colder, darker. He was isolated, monitored, and largely cut off from the world. But in the isolation, Ramirez thrived. He became an icon in the underground world of true crime fascination. He gave interviews, read satanic literature, and exchanged letters with admirers. Some described him as intelligent, charismatic, and even hypnotic. Among the most shocking events of his prison life came in 1996 when he married a woman named Doreen Lloyd, a magazine editor who had written him dozens of letters. She believed he was innocent. She claimed he was misunderstood. She told the press, "He's kind, he's funny, he's my soulmate." They were married inside San Quentin in a bizarre ceremony. Ramirez, dressed in prison blues, looked like a gothic specter. There was no honeymoon, just glass and handcuffs. Ramirez continued to appeal his conviction for years, but the evidence against him was too strong, the crimes too horrific. His lawyers argued that the trial was unfair, that the media coverage had tainted the jury, but those efforts went nowhere. By the early 2000s, Ramirez began to fade from public view. Time weakened the public's memory, and the Night Stalker became another name in the death row registry, but he remained dangerous. In one prison interview, when asked if he felt remorse, he stared into the camera and said, "No comments. You know, it's just fate. Evil has always existed." Despite his sentence, Ramirez would never be executed. On June 7, 2013, Richard Ramirez died of complications from B-cell lymphoma, a form of cancer. He was 53 years old. He also had chronic liver disease and had been on the verge of death for months. When he passed, he had spent over 23 years on death row. No final statement, no satanic ritual, no farewell to his so-called wife. He died the way he lived, surrounded by darkness, survivors and scars. Long after Richard Ramirez took his final breath inside San Quentin's infirmary, the people he hurt continued to live in the long, painful shadow of his violence. His death brought no closure. For many, it reopened old wounds, forcing survivors and victims' families to relive the most horrific chapters of their lives. The survivors of Ramirez's rampage were few, but their stories were unforgettable. Maria Hernandez, who had survived that fateful night in March 1985 by sheer chance when Ramirez's bullet bounced off her car keys, had lived for decades with survivor's guilt. She remembered the moment the gun fired, the metallic clink of the bullet deflecting, and the frozen horror as he walked into the condo to kill her roommate, Dale Okazaki. She told reporters, "I still see him in my dreams. His eyes, the emptiness in them." She never returned to that apartment. She left Los Angeles entirely, trying to rebuild a sense of safety that was forever fractured. Sakina Abawath, who had been raped while her 2-year-old son was in the house, tried to bury the trauma for years. But nightmares, panic attacks, and a deep, corrosive anxiety followed her wherever she went. "He didn't just destroy lives," she once said. "He infected people, like poison." Her son, though too young to remember the details, grew up under the shadow of the attack. Their family unit survived, but it was never the same. There were also the families of the dead people, like Jack Vinco, who found his mother, Jenny, nearly decapitated in her bed. He spent years consumed by rage. "You can't unsee something like that," he once told a reporter. "You can't hear about Satan and forgiveness in the same breath." Yet, remarkably, some found a way to turn pain into purpose. Bill Doy's daughter, an ICU nurse at the time of the trial, became an advocate for victims' rights in California. She helped push legislation for better support systems for the families of murder victims. "We were not just cases," she said. "We were people. We had lives before him." The city of Los Angeles, too, struggled with its scars. The summer of 1985 had left an entire generation of Angelenos paranoid, sleepless, and afraid to be alone. Gun sales soared. Doors were blocked. For years afterward, residents would recall that season as a kind of living nightmare. Even hardened cops admitted they had never seen anything like it. Detectives Gil Carrillo and Frank Salerno, who led the task force that eventually caught Ramirez, carried the burden of the case for years. Salerno, a seasoned detective who had helped crack the Hillside Strangler case, said Ramirez was different. He wasn't killing for money. He wasn't killing for passion. He was killing for the darkness inside him. Carrillo, the younger of the two, took the case personally. He had seen the wounds, spoken to the survivors, and watched the city unravel. "You don't just chase a man like that," he once said. "You chase the devil and pray he bleeds." In the years following Ramirez's death, there were debates over whether true evil exists, or whether Ramirez was simply a product of trauma, drugs, and unchecked psychosis. Psychologists weighed in, but few found satisfying answers. Some pointed to his cousin Miguel's war stories and the murder of his wife as the psychological trigger. Others blamed years of abuse, drug addiction, or untreated epilepsy. But to many who sat in the courtroom and stared into his dead, shark-like eyes, the question of why didn't matter. What mattered were the bodies, the terror, the lives that were shattered, and the fact that he enjoyed every moment of it. Echoes in the culture. Even in death, Richard Ramirez refused to disappear. Though buried behind prison walls for over 2 decades, his name echoed through pop culture, true crime communities, and underground fandoms in a way that disturbed even the most seasoned observers. The Night Stalker became more than a killer, he became a symbol. For some, it was a symbol of terror. For others, disturbingly, it was something darker. Fascination. Shortly after his arrest and during his trial, Ramirez gained a following unlike any serial killer before him. Letters poured into San Quentin. Women sent him provocative photos, wrote poetry in his honor, and called him their dark prince. Some claimed to have fallen in love with him purely from watching news coverage. Many were attracted to his rebellious energy, his satanic aesthetic, and the mystery that shrouded his crimes. Psychologists coined terms for atebrostophilia, the attraction to people who commit violent crimes. But Ramirez wasn't just a case study. He was a brand. In the decades after his conviction, Ramirez's likeness began appearing in unexpected places. His face was used in art galleries, featured in tattoo designs, and even printed on t-shirts. Horrorcore rappers and underground musicians referenced him in lyrics. He became a fixture in the true crime boom of the 2010s, where YouTube documentaries, podcasts, and streaming specials revisited his crimes in lurid detail. Netflix's 2021 documentary, Night Stalker: The Hunt for a Serial Killer, introduced them to a whole new generation. The show's sleek editing, grim atmosphere, and focus on the detective work reignited public interest. The documentary broke viewing records, but it also sparked criticism for how it framed Ramirez, often showing him in stylized slow-motion shots, shirtless, with eerie music playing underneath. Some viewers said it glamorized evil. Others said it told the truth, how he was charismatic, but empty inside. Then came the memes, the romanticization. On TikTok and Instagram, some users joked about his bad boy looks, his cheekbones, his mystery. Fans, many of them too young to remember the killings, shared edits, quotes, and thirst posts. It was a disturbing reflection of society's obsession with monsters. "There's something about him," one fan wrote on Tumblr. "Like he's evil, yes, but he's interesting." But for survivors and victims' families, the fascination felt like a slap in the face. How could people idolize someone who raped children, who gouged out a woman's eyes, who bludgeoned grandmothers to death and mocked the families in court? "He wasn't interesting," said one relative of a victim. "He was a coward who broke into homes and attacked sleeping people." That's not power, that's weakness. Law enforcement echoed the sentiment. Detective Gil Carrillo, in a rare interview before his death, said, "What scares me isn't that Ramirez existed, it's that people now see him as a character instead of what he was, a murderer." But in a digital age where true crime has become entertainment, Ramirez's legacy lives on not just in archives or court transcripts, but in the culture at large. There are books, documentaries, fan fiction, and conspiracy theories. Some claim he was a government experiment. Others suggest he was framed. A few fringe communities believe he was a satanic prophet. None of it changes the truth. Richard Ramirez wasn't a myth. He was real. He walked the streets. He opened windows. He whispered "Hail Satan" before pulling the trigger. And for 14 months, he held one of the largest cities in the world hostage. Anatomy of evil. Richard Ramirez wasn't just a killer. He was a case study. For criminal psychologists, forensic psychiatrists, and criminologists, he became a textbook example of what happens when trauma, neglect, and pathology are mixed with obsession, delusion, and cruelty. But even among serial killers, Ramirez stood out. His crimes weren't methodical in the way that Ted Bundy or John Wayne Gacy operated. He had no clear victim type. He attacked men, women, the elderly, children. Sometimes he raped, sometimes he didn't. Sometimes he used guns, other times knives or blunt objects. There was no pattern, only chaos. And in that chaos, experts saw something far more terrifying than a calculated killer. They saw someone who enjoyed the act of killing, someone who committed violence, not just for power or compulsion, but for spiritual fulfillment. Dr. Elizabeth Loftus, a cognitive psychologist who consulted on serial killer cases in the 1980s, once said, "Ramirez didn't need a reason. He was driven by the thrill, the domination, and the belief that he was chosen by Satan or something darker. That's what makes him different." Many experts have labeled Ramirez as a malignant narcissistic person with deep-seated grandiosity, a lack of empathy, and a sadistic need to control. He saw himself not as a man, but as a weapon forged by evil. He told one prison psychologist, "I am beyond good and evil. I am the shadow that walks. I was born to do this." He showed signs of antisocial personality disorder, along with possible schizoaffective tendencies, including hallucinations, religious delusions, and dissociation. His childhood, riddled with trauma and head injuries, likely laid the foundation for his later behavior. Multiple doctors pointed to his temporal lobe epilepsy, which can lead to hyperreligiosity, emotional detachment, and auditory hallucinations. He was known to space out for minutes at a time as a child. Some described his episodes as seizures, others as disassociation. Then there was his exposure to violence. Psychologists often cite his cousin Miguel's war stories, and particularly the moment he witnessed Mike murder his wife in front of him as a traumatic tipping point. For a young boy already surrounded by violence, that moment may have ripped apart what little moral compass he had left. Some believe he suffered from psychotic breaks that blurred fantasy and reality. To him, one profiler said, a murder wasn't just a murder, it was a ritual. It was worship. Still, many experts reject the idea that Ramirez was insane. He knew right from wrong. He evaded capture, covered his tracks, and selectively chose when to kill and when to let victims live. He bragged about his intellect. He studied Satanism the way a priest studies the Bible, and in the courtroom, he knew exactly what he was doing. He's not crazy, the lead prosecutor once said. He's evil. That's not a medical diagnosis, but it's the truth. In the end, psychologists agreed on one point. Ramirez was not born evil, but he became it. His brain, shaped by genetics, abuse, and illness, was capable of empathy. But at some point, he chose to bury that part of himself. He killed not because he had to, but because he wanted to. And when asked about remorse, he smirked. Remorse for what? He once said, "People kill people every day. I'm just honest about it." That honesty, cold, unfiltered, and brutal, is what still haunts those who study him. He wasn't hiding behind lies or excuses. He embraced what he was, a predator. The long night. There are moments in a city's history that linger not in headlines, but in the trembling hands of its people, the way they check their locks, the way they hesitate before turning off the lights. For Los Angeles, the summer of 1985 was one of those moments. It was a season drenched in fear, a season of paranoia, a season owned by the Night Stalker. The murders weren't confined to one neighborhood. They weren't even confined to one victim profile. What made Ramirez so terrifying wasn't just his brutality, was his unpredictability. He would strike in wealthy suburbs like Diamond Bar, then switch to low-income areas like East LA. He murdered couples, elderly women, and children. No age, race, or background could predict his next move. He was everywhere and nowhere. By July, the media was in full hysteria. The press used different nicknames: the Valley Intruder, the Walking Killer. But it wasn't until the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner ran the name Night Stalker that a chill truly settled over the city. The name fit. He didn't hunt in daylight. He didn't use disguise or trickery. He slipped through unlocked windows, pried open screen doors, and emerged from the shadows like a demon from a horror film. People responded by arming themselves. Gun sales exploded. Hardware stores couldn't keep deadbolts and window bars in stock. Residents started sleeping with baseball bats, shotguns, and kitchen knives on their nightstands. Police scanners became background noise in thousands of homes. Talk show hosts, pastors, and public figures addressed the crisis like it was a war. Local news stations ran nightly updates. Sketches of the suspect ghost-like were broadcast repeatedly. The entire city changed its behavior. People who never locked their doors before now barricaded themselves in. Children were forbidden to sleep with windows open. Air conditioners were left off in the punishing summer heat, just so doors and windows could stay sealed. Some neighborhoods formed informal watch groups, patrolling their streets with flashlights and walkie-talkies. Others simply prayed, and as the bodies kept piling up, the fear turned into something more primitive. You could see it on the faces of the residents, at gas stations, at church, in line at grocery stores. A city of millions was being held hostage by one man, a man no one could catch, a man who didn't care who you were or where you lived, because he didn't come to rob, he came to destroy. On the police side, the pressure was immense. Detectives Frank Salerno and Gil Carrillo were in the eye of the storm. Sleep-deprived and overwhelmed, they raced against a killer who seemed to be mocking them. Each crime scene was a puzzle soaked in blood. In Monterey Park, a woman had her eyes gouged out. In Burbank, a man was shot while sleeping next to his wife. In Arcadia, a child was kidnapped from her bedroom and assaulted before being returned. The randomness of the attacks made profiling nearly impossible. "We weren't chasing a man," Salerno later said. "We were chasing a nightmare." The community began to question everything. Was the killer supernatural? Was he part of a satanic cult? Some theorized he wasn't alone. Others whispered about government cover-ups. The horror bred conspiracy, and Ramirez fed on it. He followed the news. He relished the panic. He knew he was winning. Then came the break the fingerprint match, the release of his mugshot, and his dramatic capture in East LA. The terror finally ended, not with a tactical takedown, but with the crowd of civilians beating him bloody in the street. When the police arrived and saw who they had in cuffs, a wave of disbelief swept over the city. He wasn't a monster with horns. He was a skinny, foul-smelling man with bad teeth and dead eyes. The fear didn't disappear overnight. For months after Ramirez's capture, law remained on edge. Every bump in the night, every knock on the door, every creak in the floor. But gradually, the city began to breathe again. People reopened their windows. Neighborhoods held cookouts again. The bat by the bed was returned to the closet, but the memory never left. Even decades later, residents who lived through the Night Stalker era speak of it like survivors of a siege. Because for 14 months in 1984 and 1985, Los Angeles wasn't just a city, it was his hunting ground. The Night Stalker's legacy. Richard Ramirez left more than death and destruction in his wake. He left a legacy, one that reshaped policing, changed how forensic evidence was handled, and left a permanent imprint on how Americans think about personal safety and evil itself. For all his chaos, Ramirez inadvertently exposed holes in law enforcement systems that hadn't yet caught up with the monster he had become. In the early 1980s, fingerprint databases were still largely regional. When Ramirez was first arrested for car theft in 1981, his prints were taken, but that information stayed locked in the limited confines of local law enforcement. If not for a chance fingerprint lifted during one of his final burglaries, and the growing cooperation between departments that match might not have happened when it did. Lesson 1. Communication saves lives. In the aftermath of Ramirez's capture, California law enforcement began overhauling interdepartmental cooperation. The LAPD, LA County Sheriff's Department, and various suburban police forces initiated joint task forces with more open lines of information sharing. The California Department of Justice fast-tracked its move to digitize fingerprint and DNA data, a program that would eventually contribute to the launch of the combined DNA index system, CODIS, nationwide in the 1990s. Ramirez's crimes also highlighted the usefulness of patternless profiling. Traditional FBI behavioral profiles at the time struggled to make sense of Ramirez, who lacked the hallmarks of most serial offenders. His victims ranged in age, ethnicity, gender, and class. The randomness baffled criminologists. "He taught us that we can't rely on patterns anymore," said retired profiler John Douglas. Sometimes the profile is just this, a predator looking for opportunity, not preference. Because of this, departments became more open to the concept of geographic profiling, mapping the locations of attacks to detect potential home bases or driving routes. While Ramirez drove long distances, analysts later realized he operated largely in arcs, moving outward in chaos, but always returning to familiar territory. Lesson 2. Randomness is often an illusion. But perhaps the most profound change came not in law enforcement, but in the public. Prior to Ramirez, Southern California, like many parts of the U.S., was still caught between the suburban dream of safety and the urban reality of crime. Many residents in the 80s still left windows open on warm nights, doors unlocked during the day, garage doors unattended while working in the yard. Ramirez changed that almost overnight. People began installing motion-activated lights, home alarm systems, and security cameras in record numbers. Lock manufacturers reported surges in demand. Homeowners began trimming shrubbery to eliminate hiding places and investing in dogs, not for companionship, but for warning. He taught a city that vulnerability was everywhere, and that evil didn't always knock. In the academic world, Ramirez became a permanent fixture in criminal psychology courses. Professors dissected his upbringing, his court behavior, his crime scenes, and his interviews with the same intensity they reserved for historic war criminals. He wasn't studied to be admired, but to be understood. In doing so, Ramirez pushed the boundaries of what evil looks like. He wasn't charming, like Ted Bundy. He wasn't hidden in plain sight, like Dennis Rader. He was overt, open, proud, and that made him, in some ways, more frightening. He didn't hide his evil, said Dr. Catherine Ramsland, a criminal psychology professor. He celebrated it. That's rare, and that's dangerous. Perhaps the most disturbing part of Ramirez's legacy is his cultural immortality. Despite his death in 2013, his image still circulates. His face is printed on bootleg t-shirts. His quotes appear on social media. His likeness has even been used in horror-themed merchandise and graphic novels. In some corners of the internet, he has become a dark meme symbol of rebellion, destruction, or anti-hero mystique. And yet, the families of his victims still carry the weight. The name Ramirez is not a brand to them. It's a hole, a wound, a chapter that never fully closes. Many have fought to preserve the memory of their loved ones, not as statistics or cautionary tales, but as human beings with birthdays, favorite songs, family dinners, and dreams that were stolen. Some survivors have become speakers, activists, or trauma counselors. Others have never spoken publicly at all, but their presence is a reminder that for all the fascination surrounding Ramirez, his most enduring legacy isn't in the documentaries or the headlines. It's in the lives he destroyed and the courage of those who lived on. The man who worshipped death, Richard Ramirez, wasn't content to just kill. He wanted his murders to mean something, to reflect a worldview shaped by darkness, defiance, and death. Unlike other serial killers who murdered in secret or with shame, Ramirez turned his killing spree into a grotesque form of spiritual expression. He wasn't just taking lives, he believed he was serving a higher, darker power. That power, in his mind, was Satan. From the earliest stages of his crimes, Ramirez left behind traces of his belief system. He carved pentagrams into walls, into victim skin, and into the floorboards of homes he invaded. He whispered "Hail Satan" as bullets left his gun. On multiple occasions, he made his surviving victims swear allegiance to the devil. To some, this was mere theater, a twisted performance from a man craving infamy. But those who studied Ramirez knew better, he meant it. During interrogations and psychological evaluations, Ramirez often described his crimes in religious terms. He believed in a cosmic war between good and evil and saw himself as a foot soldier for the losing side. Not because he was forced to be, but because he chose to be. Satan is the only God who ever listened to me, Ramirez reportedly told a prison psychiatrist. Jesus abandoned me a long time ago. This mindset wasn't born overnight. As a teenager, Ramirez began reading Anton LaVey's Satanic Bibula, pseudo-philosophical texts that framed Satanism not as the worship of the devil per se, but as a rejection of Christian morality, a call for indulgence, vengeance, and self. But Ramirez went beyond philosophy. His Satanism was not metaphorical. He didn't just reject God, he believed God was weak, that mercy was a lie, and that pain was the truest form of devotion. He believed death was a sacrament, murder a ritual, rape an act of domination and cosmic balance. Where others saw brutality, Ramirez saw worship. His obsession with the occult went beyond the symbolic. He was known to carry small trinket amulets, black candles, inverted crosses. He allegedly performed rituals before some of his killings, though many details were never confirmed by authorities. He practiced lucid dreaming, attempted astral projection, and claimed he could commune with demonic forces. In his San Quentin cell, he continued his rituals. He drew demonic figures in his notebooks, corresponded with self-identified witches, and quoted Levi in letters to admirers. In one letter, he wrote, "What others call evil, I call truth. What others fear, I embrace. I am the shadow they pretend doesn't exist." Some occult experts speculated Ramirez's belief system resembled theistic Satanism, belief in Satan as a real entity deserving of worship, not just symbolic rebellion. Ramirez, in his writings, referred to the Dark Father and the Night God. He believed Satan gave him protection, purpose, and invisibility, and when he was caught, he didn't waver. In court, Ramirez entered with a smirk and a pentagram drawn on his palm. When asked if he felt remorse, he said, "No." When asked if he feared death, he replied, "I'll be back. I belong in hell." It wasn't bluster, it was faith. But many spiritual leaders and Satanism scholars have rejected Ramirez's claims, saying he warped occult teachings to justify psychopathy. Even Anton LaVey's own Church of Satan distanced themselves from him. They issued a rare public statement after his conviction. Richard Ramirez is not a Satanist. He is a criminal who used Satanism as a scapegoat for his own depravity. We do not condone violence. Still, for Ramirez, the label stuck. He wanted to be feared. He wanted to be seen as supernatural. He knew the idea of a satanic serial killer would horrify the public more than just another man with a gun and a knife. Because evil when it wears a mask is easier to explain. But Ramirez didn't wear one. He told the world exactly who he was, and he never apologized for it. Love behind bars. It defied logic. It defied morality. But it happened. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker rapist, murderer, Satanist, became the object of affection for hundreds of women, while victims' families mourned and survivors tried to rebuild their lives. Ramirez was flooded with love letters, photographs, and even marriage proposals. To the outside world, it seemed unthinkable. But to a specific, disturbingly devoted group, he wasn't a monster. He was misunderstood. The phenomenon isn't unique to Ramirez. Over the decades, many serial killers, Ted Bundy, Charles Manson, Jeffrey Dahmer, have drawn the fascination of admirers, particularly women. Psychologists call it hybristophilia, a paraphilia, where people are sexually or emotionally attracted to someone who has committed violent crimes. But Ramirez's cult was deeper, darker, and in some ways, more disturbing. By the early 1990s, his fan mail numbered in the thousands. Some of the women who wrote to him were drawn to his perceived danger. Others were convinced of his innocence, convinced he was framed by the system, and still others with spiritual believing Ramirez to be a vessel of dark energy, a martyr for Satan, a misunderstood prophet. Many of the letters were explicit. Some included nude photographs. A few women even tattooed his name on their bodies. One woman wrote, "You are the night, Richard. You're the fire that burns the liars. I dream of your voice. I believe you." Another simply said, "I would have opened the window for you." Among all his admirers, one stood out, Doreen Lloyd, a respected magazine editor from Northern California. Lloyd had seen Ramirez's trial on TV and became obsessed. Unlike the others, she didn't just write him letters. She committed herself to him. Lloyd wrote him over 75 letters during his time on death row. She visited him regularly at San Quentin, defending him in media interviews and declaring her unwavering loyalty. She told CNN, "I know he's not the monster they say he is. I see the kindness in him." Friends and colleagues were baffled. Her twin sister publicly disowned her. Her family begged her to stop, but Doreen dug in deeper. In 1996, she married Richard Ramirez inside San Quentin State Prison. He wore prison blues. She wore a simple dress. The ceremony took place in the prison's visiting area, separated by glass and surrounded by guards. There was no physical contact allowed beyond a brief kiss. Doreen changed her last name to Ramirez. She began introducing herself as his wife. She told the press she would wait for his eventual release, believing one day the truth would come out and he'd be a free man. She even said, "When he dies, I'll die too." But that didn't happen. Over time, something shifted. After nearly 14 years of marriage, Doreen stopped visiting. She withdrew from the public and reportedly ceased all contact with Ramirez. Some believe it was because of revelations that he had committed crimes against children, something she had long denied. Others believe she simply woke up from the spell. By the time Ramirez died in 2013, she hadn't seen him in years. But even after Doreen left, Ramirez's admirers did not. Right up until his final days, he was receiving letters and fan art. Even in death, tributes popped up, online tributes, not to the victims, but to him. Some wrote songs, others made fan edits and video tributes, setting his court appearances to music and quoting his more infamous lines. One TikTok user wrote, "I don't condone what he did, but there's something about him. It's magnetic." This reaction enraged the families of victims and baffled the general public. But psychologists saw it as a consequence of celebrity culture. Emotional projection, and the human desire to control chaos through obsession. Dr. Catherine Ramsland, a criminal psychologist, wrote, "Some women believe that by loving a monster, they can tame him. Others are attracted to the power he represents. It's not love, it's pathology," and Ramirez knew it. He played to his fans with handwritten letters, cryptic poems, and signed photos of himself. He fed their fantasies because he understood something chilling. People will believe whatever version of you best protects their illusion. For some, he was a predator. For others, a prophet. For a very specific few, he was Prince Charming. But for his victims, there was only one truth. He was the devil who came through the window. Final confessions. After 2 decades on California's death row, Richard Ramirez's body began to fail. But his silence never did. He had spent over 23 years locked away in San Quentin State Prison, mostly in solitary confinement. In that time, he had become a mythic figure to some, a demon to others, and a curiosity for journalists and students of criminal psychology. But despite thousands of hours spent analyzing his crimes, interrogating his motives, and dissecting his childhood, there remained one lingering hope that one day Ramirez would talk, really talk, confess, offer the truth behind the eyes that had haunted an entire city. But that day never came. By the early 2010s, Ramirez's health had deteriorated rapidly. He suffered from B-cell lymphoma, a form of cancer that attacked his lymphatic system. He also had chronic liver disease, suspected hepatitis C, and years of accumulated damage from drug abuse and neglect. He began losing weight rapidly. His already skeletal frame grew frailer. His skin, once pale and sunken, took on a sickly yellow hue. His teeth, rotted for decades, were now a constant source of pain. Despite his weakening body, Ramirez remained coldly unrepentant. Prison staff reported that he rarely spoke to other inmates. He would spend hours writing, reading occult literature, and listening to music on a small radio. He received mail until the ensign from journalists, hoping for one final interview. Some from admirers still lost in the fantasy of who they believed he was. But Richard Ramirez never gave a true, complete confession. He never offered closure. In a few brief interviews over the years, he teased admissions. He hinted at more crimes than the ones for which he was convicted. Authorities had long suspected that Ramirez was responsible for several other murders across California and even in Texas. There was the 1984 murder of a 9-year-old girl in San Francisco. The MO matched, but there was no DNA evidence at the time. Later advancements linked Ramirez's DNA to the shine butt by then. He was already on death row, and the additional charges never proceeded. "He may have killed more than we'll ever know," said one investigator. He liked the mystery. He liked having secrets only he knew. Ramirez refused to give investigators the satisfaction. On one occasion, when asked directly how many people he had really killed, he smiled and said, "More than you think, less than you fear." Even in decay, he remained cryptic. There were no last rites, no family bedside vigil. He died alone, shackled to a hospital bed in the prison infirmary on June 7, 2013. At 6:53 a.m., he was 53 years old. There was no final statement, no message to the world, no apology, no expression of guilt or sorrow. If he had any last thoughts, they were buried with him. Some close to the case hoped that with his death, the chapter could finally close. But Ramirez's silence only deepened the mystery around him. He took the truth with him, said retired detective Gil Carrillo. That's the final act of control. He got the last word by saying nothing. Ramirez's body was cremated shortly after his death. There was no public funeral. No known family members claimed the ashes. His ex-wife, Doreen Loyer, issued no statement. His final years had been spent in near total isolation, but the impact of his passing rippled out like a dark wave. For the victims' families, there was relief, but not peace. "He's gone, and I'm glad," said the daughter of one of his victims. "But it doesn't undo what he did. I still wake up thinking about that night. He died quietly," another family member said. "He didn't deserve quiet." Journalists and documentarians flooded the airwaves with retrospectives. News anchors called it the end of the Night Stalker. But for many, it was never about Ramirez's physical existence. It was about the terror he represented, The idea that evil could enter your home, that it could have a name, that it could smile at you in court. In the end, Richard Ramirez's greatest power wasn't his cruelty, was his refusal to give closure. He didn't explain, he didn't cry, he didn't beg for forgiveness. He remained, until the last second, exactly what he wanted to be. An unanswered question, a city that remembers. Los Angeles never fully recovered from the summer of 1985. The Night Stalker didn't just scar victims, he stained neighborhoods, broke families, and shifted the psychology of an entire metropolis. His name became shorthand for terror, his crimes a template for unimaginable evil. And even decades later, his shadow lingers. Every major true crime wave leaves a cultural footprint. The Zodiac Killer, the Hillside Stranglers, the Golden State Killer, but Richard Ramirez left behind something deeper, a disruption of innocence, the realization that death could come not with a warning, but in the middle of the night, silently, without reason. The randomness of his violence permanently changed the city's relationship with safety. Many who lived through those nights say they still double-lock doors and avoid sleeping with open windows. Others admit they suffer from residual anxiety, flashes of panic, when they hear footsteps outside or catch the creak of a floorboard at 3 a.m. A whole generation of Angelenos grew up with Ramirez's face burned into their memory. Hollow-eyed smirking, as if to say, I could be anyone. In the neighborhoods where Ramirez struck Boyle Heights, Monterey Park, Whittier, Mission Viejo memorials were held after his death. Some were small, private vigils. Others were symbolic gestures, candles placed on sidewalks, prayer circles in homes that had been silent for decades. But the strongest legacy lies in the survivors. People like Maria Hernandez, who faced him down and lived. People like the young children he let go, who carried his darkness into adulthood, but refused to be defined by it. People like the mothers, sons, sisters, and husbands of victims, who never let the world forget the names behind the headlines. Maxine and Vincenzo Delo, William and Lily Maylou, Peter and Barbara Pan, Ilias, Jenny Van. These were real people, with homes, with laughter, with dreams, not numbers, not scenes in a documentary. The families of these victims have spent decades rebuilding lives, forming support groups, and testifying before parole boards, making sure that even if Ramirez's name persists, his victims are remembered not just for how they died, but for how they lived. The Night Stalker also changed how cities prepare for evil. Law enforcement agencies across the country cite the case as a turning point. It helped inspire widespread insurgency data sharing, DNA collection and database reform, the creation of task forces for crimes with no clear motive, expanded victim advocacy services in urban areas. Ramirez's spree taught investigators that evil doesn't always fit the mold. It doesn't always have a pattern. And sometimes, the monster doesn't look like a monster, just a man, walking down the street with a toothless grin and a stolen car. But even with these advances, the fascination remains. People still search his name, watch his documentaries, study his face for answers. Some are trying to understand, some are drawn to darkness. Others are simply obsessed with true crime. But for the city that bore the brunt of his horror, Ramirez is more than a character. He's a reminder that evil is real, that it doesn't need permission, and that sometimes the only thing between you and it is a locked door roar, a neighbor brave enough to stop it. In the end, Richard Ramirez died in a hospital bed, but his story didn't. It lives in interviews, in court transcripts, in the whispered memories of a city that still shivers when it hears the words, the Night Stalker. But most importantly, it lives in the strength of those who survived him. The families who refused to let him become bigger than the people he hurt. Because for all his bravado, for all his evil, he wasn't a god. He wasn't a demon. He was just a man. And in the end, even death came for him.